and then into a Schism. And then we remember that you're Kyrian, so you don't have Mind Games, but here is where you should do, it should be Mind Blast into Penance rather than Penance into Mind Blast, and the reason for that is right here you can see your Mind Blast getting cancelled, and that's probably, I would assume just looking at the log, that this is when, because this is when the raid's taking damage from Expunge. So you're probably having to move out of the raid group, and now you can't, you know, finish your cast of Mind Blast, or you can't cast Smites, and you're having to like get out of the raid to drop the Expunge. And there's this giant gap where now you applied all your atonements, you pressed Spirit Shell, but now you missed like 80% of your damage abilities here. Which there's two ways of fixing this. The first way is you press Mind Blast first, like I mentioned, after Schism, and then you Penance, because then when you Penance, you can start moving out of the raid with the Penance, because you can move while casting. So that lets you kind of get into a good spot while channeling that ability. And then to get all these Smite casts off, it's either just once you're outside, you know, once you kind of get out of the raid and are ready to drop Expunge, since you moved with Penance, now you can stand still and like smite the boss a bunch while you're waiting. Or, like I mentioned earlier, if we got that ramp to just, if you hit Spirit Shell like 3 or 4 seconds earlier than when you did, it would literally line up to where you would have got these smites off, and then we're able to move out of the group, if that makes sense. So it would just time a lot better with your movement. And we can go in here, and this is happening at like 2 minutes into the fight. So we can just go in the VOD and go to 2 minutes and just see, you know, a better example of it, and see if the way that we explained it is kind of what happened. It's going to be coming up here. This is where you're casting those Shadow Mends before the ramp. And then here's your ramp. 1, 2, 3, 4. Here's your first Radiance. Refresh your dot, another Radiance. And then Schism. And so you're penancing here, and then you're Mind Blasting, but then you're kind of stuck in this awkward spot. You get knocked back a little bit. Okay, so it did happen a little bit differently because your group is actually handling this mechanic a lot differently than, like, for instance, I'm used to handling it. But it's still like a similar situation, so we can kind of look back on it. I could explain like what you could have done, I guess, differently in this situation specifically. I think the first thing is anytime the game is like forcing you to move because of a mechanic or anything like that, you should always try to, you know, utilize something while moving. So for instance, Penance, like, you know, right here, everyone's getting targeted by the Expunge, so you know that you're gonna have to get out of the raid. So since you haven't pressed Penance yet, it should just be, you should press Penance, and then while you're channeling that Penance, you should be looking to move with it. So like right here, you channel Penance, you kind of start moving, and that's fine. But I would say like once you landed in a spot after Penance is done channeling, whether it's a good spot or not, you should probably just commit to it and stand there.
Gotcha.
And then the other thing is like at the end here, you can kind of see yourself after you Penance and kind of move out of the way here. So you move a little bit, and then your Penance finishes, you stand, you know, kind of still moving. Like right here, you should just be completely standing still and just spamming smites into the boss. Because you have all those atonements going, so you need to make them, you know, you need to make them do something. You need to be generating the shields on them before they go away. Even if that means, because there's no real reason to come back and stack with the raid, right? Like you could just be standing out here and you're still just as effective as if you were stacking in the group. So it's just, I think the concept to get across is like only move when the game absolutely forces you to move. And then, you know, if you can manage like standing still, then you should just stand still. Like that was better movement there. It's just now, you know, that wasn't in the middle of your ramp, so it's a lot less, like the other was a lot more punishing because it was like in the middle of your ramp, so. Does that all make sense so far? Do you have any like questions about that or anything?
Mm-hmm. No, makes sense.
Cool. And then yeah, like we said, the Mind Blast first would have helped a little bit because then you could have Mind Blast, Penance, get to a nice spot, and then stand still and smite. But I think the main thing is just make sure that if you're going to be in the middle of your ramp and stuff, just try to commit to it fully and just move as little as possible, because the amount of like cast you get off here, especially smites towards the end of a ramp, is really, really crucial to how much healing you're going to do with that ramp. Cool. So we can look at another one real quick. The next double one that we have is Spirit Shells here, so we'll just look at that one. Okay, so this looks like another ramp for Expunge. Press it at 337. And the damage happens at 349, so that's pretty good. Yeah, I would say the timing's fine. Maybe like 2 seconds ahead, but it doesn't have, again, it doesn't have to be like absolutely perfect. As long as you're getting the shields applied before the damage happens and the shields are staying on the group, which they more than likely are in this situation, then you're totally fine.
Who are we going to kill today?
And then we can go down here. We'll say this is the start of the ramp, so it's a Shadow Mend. And then because Shadow Mend is a slightly longer cast time than our GCD until we have a certain amount of haste, you might have the amount of haste for it, but even with that, you usually always want to apply all your atonements with shields like this, and then just the first one should be a Shadow Mend, so it should just go Shadow Mend, shield, shield, you know, and then follow up. And then we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, so that's perfect. That's how many we want. You have your Radiance, you refresh your dot, your Radiance, that's good. Macro, do your abilities, that's good. Schism, and then we see that same pattern again here. You Schism, Smite, Penance, Mind Blast, but by the time you cast this Mind Blast here, you've already lost like these 4 atonements back here. So now that Mind Blast applies to 4 less atonements, which Mind Blast by far is like the heaviest hitting spell you have, so it's really, that's why we want to cast it directly after the Schism, is so that it applies to like every atonement before they fall off. Because it adds a lot more of a shield than, say, casting a Smite. So it should be Schism, Mind Blast, Penance, and then you Smite spam. And then here again we see a little bit of an interruption, but it looks like you recover okay. So we can say you got like 4 total Smites off in this ramp, which it depends on your haste, but usually you want to get somewhere between like probably 5 to 7 Smites before your atonements fall off. That's just kind of a guesstimate, but and then this is where you cast a Boon of the Ascended. And if I'm not 100% certain on like the perfect usage of Boon of the Ascended, as I play Venthyr, but I'm pretty sure that Boon of the Ascended is actually a lot better to use outside of your ramp, so you use it like during downtime. So if we like reset the zoom here, you'd want to use Boon of the Ascended in like these spots here where you're just using a single Radiance, and then like, you know, this spot here or this spot here, and I think it's like a 3-minute cooldown, so you could use it like here on this first one and then somewhere back here towards like the back half of the fight. And I think that's just because it's kind of awkward to line up with ramp, because it like takes a little while to cast and build up and stuff, so it's just better to use during downtime with like a little less atonements. But I could be wrong about that.
Yeah, I'm honestly not sure why I cast it there, because I normally don't try to cast it to stack with an atonement.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if there was damage I was trying to heal up or what it was.
And that's what we could use the log for instance. So I think that ramp was happening.
Yeah, it was damage. That's what it was.
I think that was this one here at 3:30. This is where you start your ramp. There's those 3 Shadow Mends, and then you start shielding. There's your Spirit Shell cast, Schism, Smite. I think that was a pretty good like sequence of events still. The other thing to keep in mind here, again, like just making another note of this, is when you have to move, you know this expunge is coming because Desolate just happened, and after every Desolate, there's always going to be an expunge. So you should just already, like, while you're channeling that penance, you should just already be moving out of the group, so you're already in a spot where you don't have to move, because then you're already outside of the group. Everyone else you can just trust to move around you, and then you can just stand still and spam cast, Smite and Mind Blast or whatever you have left.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just that idea of like really making sure that no matter what situation we're in, if we're in our ramp and we're at the end of that ramp where we're pressing our damage abilities, we want to just really plant our feet and just spam as many spells into the boss as possible before the atonements run out. And that's the other minor thing is like, or I guess it's a major thing, is like when those atonements are on people, after you finish your ramp, you want to just keep spamming Smite until they're, like, every single one of them falls off. Like, you shouldn't reapply any atonements until they're all gone.
Gotcha.
Just to make sure you get every last, drop of the ramp. Okay, cool. And then, so those are like your major ramps. There's one back here too, but we'll just go ahead and start looking at like some, I'll show you how to look at like these mini ramps, because those are also fairly important once we like really nail down the major ramps, which I would say you're doing pretty good. It's just like it's the priority of abilities that you're using after Schism, so just making sure that you're Mind Blasting first and then Penancing. And then outside of that, just making sure that you're planting your feet and spamming a little bit more smites towards, that back half of the ramp.
I know the mini ramps are going to be pretty gnarly, and that kind of plays into one of the questions I was going to ask is, my mana goes to hell.
Okay, yeah.
So I've kind of gotten in the habit of, like, I think in that fight, I think I cast Mind Blast only when I was in my major ramp.
Yeah, and you should pretty much do that.
So on the mini ramps, I mean, a lot of times I just spam Smite in between, and it's not much of a mini ramp. I think the only reason I honestly threw the Radiance out there at one was because I knew I was going to miss my Spirit Shell, and I put it out there to heal through that second expunge. Not thinking about hitting a Spirit Shell at Consume, which I'll change my timings for. But yeah, how do you juggle that as like mana management, I guess is the best way to put it, as far as being able to do the mini ramps and the major ramps without just totally going after, typically it's about like 4.5 minutes is where I start having problems.
Yeah, for sure. So the first major thing is, we'll just look at this. So we'll take like group comp and all that stuff out of the window, and any like guild setups or anything. And the first thing is, this is just like your atonements applied throughout the fight. So you can see obviously where your major ramps are right here, these like giant bumps. And then all these little bumps are either where you were using like single radiances, or you were maybe just applying atonements through other spells. And typically what we want to see is there should be a lot more like downtime here, because you're having like too many of these like kind of larger bumps. And the way we do that is just whenever, so I like to think of Priest as having like 3 major phases. So you have, your major ramp, which is where you're doing as many atonements as possible, you're double radiancing, you're popping your cooldowns, you're DPSing. That's like these giant bumps. And then you have your mini ramps, which are just applying like 4 to 5 atonements and then pressing radiance. So that would be like these ones here, or these ones that kind of spike up to like 10. Like this one here's a good one, because we're getting 4 to 5 atonements out, and then we're pressing radiance, which adds another 5 to that number. And then we're just pressing Smite and Penance just to kind of, help heal the group and just use a free Radiance charge since we have one while we're waiting for our cooldowns to come back up. And then the last phase, which should be, the in between all of that. So we have our major ramps, and then in between the major ramps, we have our mini ramps. And then in between the major and the mini ramps here should be like our real downtime, which is pretty much only applying like at most 5 atonements, and it's pretty much, sorry, my cat is going crazy.
Okay.
Only applying like 2 at most 5 atonements, but I like to say like 2 to 4, and that's pretty much only using atonements on the tank if they need it, and if they're both taking damage, so you just apply to atonement to whichever tank is taking damage, and then you're only using smite and penance, and you're not casting like any other spells whatsoever. You're not casting Radiance, you're not casting Shadow Mend, you're not casting Mind Blast. And the only time you apply more than, 1 to 2 atonements on the tanks is if, say for instance, there's a fight where like players get debuffed by a certain ability and, they have like a heavy hitting dot on them for the next 10 seconds, then yeah, you'd probably want to apply atonement on them also during the downtime. But again, only if your mana allows. Like as a Disc Priest, it's really important to understand that your job is these giant ramps. That is what you excel at as a Disc Priest, is having this like huge coverage every minute or minute and a half into the fight. And outside of that, you really have to just like let go of the reins and let the other healers kind of pick up your slack essentially in that downtime. And so like here where you're seeing a bump and then a bump, that's making a mistake. Like there should only be one bump here, up to 5 or up to 10 from like that mini ramp that you do, and then it should dial back down to like 2 to maybe at most 5 atonements for the rest of the time until you get here to this big ramp again. And then it should teeter back down. It should be back down to like 2 at most 4, and then it should be another mini ramp here that goes up to about 10, and then it should teeter back down, and it should stay down again to like 2 or 4 here instead of ramping back up. Like you can see here, it ramps up again. This should just stay completely low until this major ramp, and then it's repeating that same step over and over. So hopefully that like makes sense and is useful. And to get to this page, if you ever want to like check this out, because this is a good like overview of seeing maybe if you've made mistakes in applying atonements or burning through too much mana, is you're just gonna go. I'll just go ahead and reset this real quick. So we just go to the fight, we're going to go to buffs, and then under all sources, it's really important if there's multiple priests in the raid, so you're going to click on all sources and then just find yourself. You just click on yourself, and then go to all abilities and click atonement, and then that shows us this, and then we just need to scroll down and hit stacked. And then we can click that little button to like zoom it out, and then we get this.
Cool.
Awesome. Outside of that, is there any like questions or things you want me to kind of re-go over or anything like that?
Okay, so talked about timings, try to space out. Focus more on 10 to 15. I guess just for some of the stuff we talked about. So on getting my timings for boss abilities, and the reason I did Hungering is because it's pretty consistently, it seems to be like 30 seconds, minute 30.
Yeah, this is a very good fight for log reviews for sure.
But there's other fights like Lady Darkvein or Huntsman or stuff like that where there's a lot less predictable damage. Is there and again, in looking at logs and whatnot, everybody seems to have a slightly different timing, and sometimes abilities come out at different timing. Like Artificer, the glyphs come out 5 seconds one way or 10 seconds another way or something like that. How do you pin your timings down so that you're I guess consistently in that window? Do you just rely on DBM or bigwigs? Do you run a ramp timer on the side? What do you tend to try to do?
I typically rely on like bigwigs, but I also rely on just muscle memory, because what I'm thinking of when I'm doing a fight as a Disc Priest is say we go back to Hungering Destroyer just for. And I'm just going to pull up your Spirit Shell cast real quick. Cool. So here, like, we look back at this and we say, let's just pretend that, you were in a guild and you were assigned to, do these, or you decided, hey, I'm going to ramp for each of these abilities. So you say the first Desolate, I'm going to ramp for. The third expunge I'm going to ramp for, the fourth, or this would be the fifth expunge I'm going to ramp for, and then the last expunge of the fight I'm going to ramp for. And that's the way I think about it, is I think of it through like more of a numbers game of counting the abilities rather than relying on, you know, this expunge happens at 2 minutes and that's when I need to ramp, or this expunge happens at 3:48 or something and I need to ramp. Like, I think of it more like, you know, the fourth expunge has happened in the fight, this consume's gonna happen, and then I know that I'm up. Like, I know that that's where I want to use my spirit shell, if that kind of makes sense. And I use the same thing in like Zymox, for instance, so I'll kind of count the glyph of destructions as they happen. And a lot of the time bigwigs will put like a number next to each ability as it's cast, so that helps as well.
That makes, yeah, okay.
And then that way,
timing that out, like for hungering here, if I'm going to
Mhm.
ramp for that first consume, damage comes out at about 130. That means I need to get a spirit shell off at 120 plus or minus.
yeah, I would say even take some.
115.
Yeah, I would say even take some time extra, like 115, because you know that consumes an ability you're gonna have to move for, so you're gonna want to really make sure you get all of that ramp finished before you have to do like any moving. Because if you have to start moving, that means you don't get to cast smite, which is, I mean, that you may as well not ramp if you're gonna, you know, miss like the entire back half of your ramp.
So then if I'm going to do that, that means I need to get my first ramp cast at like 110-ish, which is, I think that's why that one's at 112.
Mm-hmm.
Is that enough leeway to get out for the first Desolate?
Yeah, I definitely think so.
Or do you just cast it at 5 seconds into the fight? And,
yeah, because the first Desolate, like, usually this one can vary just a tiny bit pole by pole, but I would say about 15 seconds. So yeah, you can pretty much start your ramp like I think what I usually do on Hungering Destroyers, I start my ramp like the moment they pull the boss. Like, as soon as they pull the boss, I'm casting all my spells and ramping up and doing all that stuff. And then that makes it time out pretty well.
Okay, makes sense. So I guess, so targets that I've looking at, like Shriekwing's Wave of Blood, Hungering is Desolate, Expunge, Consume, depending on which one they're at. Artificer's Glyph of Destruction. Sludge, it seems like it's Colossal Roller Pillars, so that's pretty straightforward.
Mm-hmm.
Blood Prince, or I'm sorry, Denathrius, Blood Prince in Phase 1. The kind of in-between ones are the ones where I'm a little bit, like, I think Hungering...
Yeah, I think Huntsman's a really good example of this, like what you're talking about is like having no clue what to ramp for, because a lot of the fight is just like really random.
Yeah, and I think I timed it out where I was like the first, I think I tried to go with the first Sin Seeker and then just on cooldown after that, which I think I ran out of mana, which is why I cast what the hell.
Okay, so what I like to do for Huntsman's still like a difficult one. When you're in Mythic, it's a lot easier because you have like almost half your raid or more getting hit by each Sin Seeker because they have to soak them. So it makes it to where you can just say, I'm going to ramp for, you know, every Sin Seeker, every other Sin Seeker whenever they're cast, because you can see when they're cast here, 30 minutes, 2 minutes, little before 3 minutes, so you can kind of plan them out accordingly. But on Heroic and Normal, only like a few people get hit, like 3 people, so it makes it not really worth ramping for. So in Phase 1, I usually just ramp for the first Sin Seeker because there's nothing really else meaningful to ramp for. So you might as well just get it on cooldown. And then the main thing in Phase 1 of Huntsman is just don't waste your mana, because Phase 2 and Phase 3 is where Disc Priest can actually do a ton of healing if you line up things correctly. So for instance, in Phase 2, what you should be trying to ramp for is Rip Soul, because you can cover every other Rip Soul because it happens every 30 seconds here.
Gotcha.
So Rip Soul is a big one, and the main thing that you want to keep in mind is you should not be healing the Rip Soul as a Disc Priest. You should be healing the raid so that your other healers can heal the Rip Soul, because you aren't good at healing the Rip Soul, but other healers are. So if you're sitting there spamming healing on the Rip Soul, you're just going to make your other healers have to heal the raid instead, and now you're like, you know, unbalancing that whole... It's just like a juggling act of having all the healers do all the wrong jobs. So you should just stick to what you're good at and just focus on healing the raid. And if, you know, if the Rip Soul really needs that much help and getting topped off, then you can like throw a Shadow Mend on it or apply an Atonement to it or something.
Sure.
And then in phase 3, you're basically taking damage non-stop throughout the whole phase, like every time they move the boss. So this is where it's pretty safe to say just use a ramp on cooldown. Or you can line it up if you really want to, just to make sure that your ramp is getting as used as possible, is with the Sin Seeker. So you could do like the first Sin Seeker of phase 3, I'm going to ramp, and then the second Sin Seeker, because it happens like a little bit less. I think it happens every 45 seconds, so you can't ramp for every one, but you could do every other. And as far as like finding that out, it's really just trial and error. Like, I think it really just came down to me doing the fight like once or twice and then going, okay, like, you know, this fight's super awkward. I have no idea how to ramp for it, but these abilities seem, you know, like they could be useful. And then I go in here and I just check the cast of like the different bosses. You just hit enemies up here and then cast, and then you can like select each boss and see their cast. And it just lets you kind of figure out and math out like, you know, maybe where you should be using your cooldowns, or where, you know, if like for instance Sin Seeker, it's happening pretty much every minute, but then here it happens like every 45 seconds in some phases, so it doesn't allow you to ramp for it properly. So you'd have to do like every other one. So it's really just it's just going to come down to trial and error, and then just kind of figuring out the fight for yourself, watching like other VODs or something if other guilds have killed it before you, or, you know, just checking out stuff like that. So and Lady of Nerva is another good example, because that one's really dependent on your group. Because without them communicating to you when they're gonna drain the anima containers, it's kind of really messy. So the way I usually do it is I will just ramp every time I see a container switch. Because when the containers switch, your group should theoretically be draining the previous one that was just active, which makes it completely, like, you know, it makes it easy to line up. And it's okay if you start your ramp late in that sense, like say, you know, the anima container switches and then they start draining it, but you haven't started your ramp. That's totally fine, because that drain is going to persist for like the next 45 seconds. So you can just ramp while it's happening.
Gotcha.
I don't know if you can actually see casts of it. It's like you...
Yeah, that's been the trick for me, is on some of these trying to like track down when they actually cast. They like Lady's perfect one is, you know, I know when she's throwing the bottles at the raid, but that's about...
Yeah, I think the best way to predict like when a container is going to switch, again, you can just see when it switches and then go, okay, I'm going to start ramping now that it's switched. Or the other way you do it is just keep track of like how full the anima containers are, and when one is like hitting its level 3 marker, which is around, I think it happens at like 66% of the energy, you can start ramping like right then, because it's either going to switch soon, or either way it has, you know, a level 3 empowerment, so it's probably going to do a decent amount of damage to the raid if it stays active. So yeah, Lady of Nerva is another one of those tricky ones where there's no like, you know, there's no right answer unless you are in like a really coordinated group and they kind of set it up for you. But in an uncoordinated group, you just have to just do your best. And I think the best way is just use your judgment of when the containers switch, you just start ramping. You just kind of ramp every time a container switches.
That makes sense. What about Stone Legion and Council? Or the Generals and Council? Because that's where I run into the same one as far as...
Okay,
like,
yeah,
like
Council is actually
Council.
really easy. And I will show you... So with Council, you can actually pretty much see it here. These like dips, and this is the damage taken from the raid, or the raid taking damage. So the longer you're in each phase, you'll gain like a stacking debuff that deals damage over time to the whole raid. So essentially all you want to do as a Disc Priest, it makes it really easy, because these, if you look at these, like each of these ramps, they're happening almost every minute. So you have, you know, this first one like peaks at about 40 seconds. The second one peaks at about, this would be about 2 minutes, we'll say. And then the next one peaks at, you know, 3 minutes, and then the next one peaks a little bit before 4 minutes. And I guess these are kind of the same, but either way, like these peaks are, you know, relatively about a minute to a minute and a half apart. So what you can do is, the way that I judge this, or the way I found this out, is just that stacking debuff that's on the raid. Once it gets to about like 6 stacks, you can start ramping. Or what I like to do that makes it even easier, instead of tracking the debuff or worrying about that, is just track the boss's HP. So your debuff is going to the whole raid's debuff is going to reset every time a boss either hits 50% HP or 0% HP, because that's when like you're transitioning phases, because you're either going and doing the dance, or you're, you know, the boss is dying and you're killing a new boss, and all your stacks reset. So all you do is you just go off the boss's HP. So once the boss is about 70% HP, that's when you should probably start ramping, because you want to get like a big ramp in right before the phase transitions, or, you know, as the phase is transitioning. That way, when the raid is taking the most amount of damage, which is right before the transition happens, you're putting out the most amount of healing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, totally. And that would be like 70, and then again at 20.
Yeah, and then again at 20. Yeah, exactly.
Assuming that the boss doesn't die before that.
Yep. And I'm pretty sure it lines up almost perfectly. Like, this is our council kill, for instance. We kill it relatively fast compared to most groups, but we have, you know, 35 seconds. The first boss is at 60. We could say you'd start ramping like right around 25 or 30 seconds.
Mm-hmm.
Then we do the dance. And then the boss again is at, you know, 20%. This is at 2 minutes and 13. So you'd be holding on to your cooldown for a little while if you want to do that. And that's where it's just your judgment call. But I would say it's definitely worth it. It's just hold your cooldown every time for when the boss gets low and you're starting to get to the end of that phase. Because you really, again, as a Disc Priest, you want to do what you're good at, which is carrying your group through like really intense moments in fights. Next boss is 70% right at 320, so that lines up just after a minute after we used our last ramp. And then he's at 20% at like almost five minutes. So that dance is what like separates our spirit shell cooldown, but that's totally fine. Like, we don't have to use spirit shell every minute if, you know, we're covering something very important. The thing we take away from here is that you can literally ramp every time you're getting to the end of a phase, like when the boss is, you know, 60%, 10%, or whatever.
Right, that makes sense.
And then for Stone Legion Generals, what I did was I just typically ramped for every, or not every, but whenever I had Spirit Shell available, I would just ramp for the Crystallize. Because the Crystallize is when, like, the raid in general is going to take the most amount of damage. I'm pretty sure we could actually go in here and just see when Crystallize is being cast. And, like, for instance, in the first phase, Crystallize doesn't get cast at all. So we can find, like, something else to ramp for. You have Crystallize. These are happening... this looks like every 45 seconds, just about, if I just had to take a random guess of just like looking at this. Yep. So we can, you know, we could ramp for every other, which would be totally fine. I would probably just do that, because every other is going to be about a minute and 30 seconds apart, so that's not holding your cooldown for very long. And it looks like Crystallize does still happen in the first phase. I was mistaken. I was thinking about the other ability. So yeah, I would just ramp for every other Crystallize, is seeming like it would be the best bet in this fight. And again, the way I found that out, or thought of that, is just trial and error of just doing the fight and seeing what the raid is taking the most damage from. That's really all you can do.
Yeah, it makes sense. I keep asking questions. I got one last one for you, and I'm gonna
For sure.
let you go. So I typically just switch to Holy on Sun King because Guardian Spirit and
Mm-hmm.
like I feel like I can actually heal the fight. And it doesn't seem like damage is that bad. I mean, do you just sit there and pump heals into Sun King, or do you try to cover the raid, or do you really? I mean, the first time I did it with the guild, which was on normal, we had 3 healers with Guardian Spirit. I mean,
Yeah.
it just.
Yeah, if you're doing like the Holy Priest cheese or you have a lot of healers, like you're, overstacking healers or something, then yeah, you just all pump healing into the boss and you're done. If you wanted to play Disc for this fight, it would just be, again, you're going to do what you're good at, which is not healing the boss. So all you do is keep an Atonement active on the boss, and then the rest of your time should just be focused on healing the raid for like the ads that are, doing damage to the raid, and then let your other healers like focus more of their attention on the boss.
Makes sense.
But yeah, Holy is like typically the quote unquote better option because it just lets you kind of cheese the fight. But say for instance you're doing the fight like realistically and you're not just able to pump heals into the boss and you're gonna actually have to help, kill ads or heal the raid or do these things, then Disc might be a good alternative because then you can, you might be able to do a better job of doing that while your other healers heal the boss.
I appreciate it a ton. It's you're watching 4 million hours of videos and feeling like I've looked at logs forever and trying to compare
for sure.
like there's like little lingering questions or something.
No, yeah, I totally understand. Yeah, I mean that's how I learn this stuff is literally just so much time investment. So that's why I want to help people out is like people just don't have that amount of time to commit, and it's really all people need to be doing is just be shown this like a few times, once or twice, and just get the hang of how to look at it themselves, and then it like so much more stuff starts clicking, and it feels a lot more rewarding because some of this stuff you can't figure out really unless you really spend so much time and do so much extra research and whatnot.
I think I spent an hour just looking at Warcraft logs to try to figure out how it worked.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, exactly.
Shoot, thanks again. I really, really appreciate it. Is there anything?
As far as I know, it seems like you covered all like the important topics as far as I know. So, I mean, if there's anything that comes up or that you forgot to ask that you remember, you can always just shoot me a DM. That's totally fine. Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Thank you for taking the time to sit down and chat. That was fun. Yeah, you as well.